Hi, my name is Leanne Friesen, and I'm the lead pastor of Mount Hamilton Baptist Church and a part of the True City movement.
And I'm Dave Witt, and I am the network facilitator for the True City Network in Hamilton, Ontario.
This is a picture of a communion table. It's a nice table, though an imperfect one. But to us, it's a beautiful table. This is not just a communion table, but it is a table with a story. Today, we want to tell you the story of this table. We want to tell you a story of what it looks like when God's people gather around God's table, and how a movement called True City in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, taught us about a new way of gospel collaboration that has changed our city and changed us.
It starts in 2004 when the pastors from 3 churches from 3 different denominations approached me and a couple of other urban missionaries who work for international teams and asked us if we would be willing to help their churches collaborate in mission. We were aligned around a conviction that churches have something unique to offer to our city and a dream of collaboration in the gospel. It starts with a few basic cooperative efforts. We did some Christmas hampers together and a couple coordinated community cleanups. Then we stretched out further. We embraced the name True City and settled on the tagline, Churches Together for the Good of the City, as a way to capture our vision of pursuing God's shalom intention for Hamilton. We held a conference together, invited other churches to join in, and that first conference really showed us that there was a hunger to find practical church-based ways of pursuing the good of our city among a variety of churches, and that there was a new kind of collaboration that had significant potential. Over those first few years together, we helped start a reception center for refugee claimants in our city called Micah House. We experimented with a collaborative youth service event in partnership with a group from Redeemer University College. We helped 2 of the churches involved in the network to plant other churches in different parts of the city. And we found ways for churches to learn from the examples of each other, to find practical ways that they could be involved in their neighborhoods and to do variations on that theme in other places in the city. So that things like volunteering in local schools or starting neighborhood community dinners or sports leagues for youth. After the first year, 3 more churches joined in, and by the end of year 6, there were 11 churches who had formally entered into partnership with each other, including a couple of the church plants. So the group that was coming together around the shared table was growing.
Now, I came into True City just a year into its inception. I've been at my church for 16 years, and I had just joined as lead pastor of my church when Dave approached me and invited me to a gathering of a number of pastors. And he explained that this was a chance to grow in mission together. And so what we would do is once a month, we would get together, and one of us would bring our job descriptions for each of us to discuss together. And we would examine together how that pastor's job description could create more space for missional living in their church. This was just a totally new thing to me, mind-blowing. This idea of pastors analyzing their job description together, asking the questions of what it meant to help each other think outside of our own church walls. This was life-changing for me in ministry. Eventually, my church, Mount Hamilton, became a partner True City Church as well. And this began to shift how we did mission as a church. We were no longer simply saying, what are the things that we want to do? But every time we would engage in a missional activity, we'd begin with the question of, could we do this with someone else? Is there a way to join another church in doing this? Is another church already doing the same thing? And if they are, do we actually need to do it? Or could we partner with another church in this? One of the tangible ways that this played out, for example, was with something as simple as vacation Bible schools, which so many of our churches were a part of. And I remember when we started saying, well, probably we don't need to do the same vacation Bible school the same week as a church up the road. And then it moved to maybe we could share our resources. What other churches are doing the same vacation Bible school? And we could share decorations. And as we started doing more full-fledged kids camps at our churches, we actually got to the place where we would partner with another True City church and send some of our volunteers to the week that they were running camp. And then they would send volunteers to us on the week that we were running camp. This wasn't just about saying we were another ecumenical movement. This was about trading ecumenicalism for true collaboration, actually doing mission together. We wanted something that wasn't just about pastors. It wasn't just another ministerial. It wasn't about simply asking, what's another thing on our to-do list? But it was about whole congregations coming together in mission, not seeing each other as competition, but as co-laborers in the kingdom, praying for each other, seeking the good of one another, celebrating what was happening in one another's churches. And our church became one of many churches now being shaped by this new kind of gospel collaboration.
Yeah, there are literally hundreds of stories that I could tell, and often do, about how a network committed to centering the missional call to pursue the good of the city led to grassroots collaboration between churches that are different from each other in significant ways. Like the youth group at the Conservative Brethren Gospel Chapel that became the place that the children of a bunch of different church planters brought their friends because their churches didn't yet have youth groups. Or the way that the various churches in the network got behind the successful initiative of one of the church plants to lobby the city for a massive increase in bike lanes. We partnered with the Greater Ontario House of Prayer to host a prayer room for 2 weeks after each year's conference, for 24/7 prayer for 2 weeks. And it deepened the way that our churches were engaging prayer together. And as many as 50 different churches would come to those prayer rooms over those 2 weeks. Or there was the way that older pastors in established churches who had church planting experience started a group to mentor and assist the cohort of young church planters that were just getting started. As a matter of fact, one of those church planters often talks about how he would be in conversation with church planters in other cities, and they would be amazed at how these churches were supporting them, because in their cities, the established churches were the competition. None of these were centrally planned initiatives. They bubbled up from the grassroots. But because there's a network of churches that have come to trust each other, the impact of these initiatives gets broadened and amplified. It was becoming clear that the Spirit had more room to initiate when we came together around shared tables that cultivated unity in a way that valued this new kind of collaboration more than doing our own thing.
I love all those stories, Dave, but one of my very favorites, my favorite story, involves a woman named Anna. I'm going to call her Anna. And this story began a few years into our time in True City when I got a call at my office one day from a woman who attended another True City church in our city. In fact, it was just a young church plant with just a few families, and the woman who called was the pastor's wife. And she called to explain that she had been getting to know a woman at her school. She was a teacher. And this woman, Anna, was really expressing an interest in learning more about God. And she had decided she would like to try going to church. But when this teacher looked and saw where Anna lived, and Anna didn't drive, she realized it would be really hard for Anna to get to her church. This little church plant that usually, wants as many new people as they can get, certainly people that weren't yet Christians, to lead them to Christ. And she said, as she looked at the map, she looked for the closest True City church to Anna, and it was us. And she explained that she was going to bring Anna that Sunday to our church and, just to let us know what was going on, and asked us to kind of join her in this journey, which I was excited to do. And so that Sunday, sure enough, this woman with Anna showed up at our church. She introduced us, and then she didn't come back. This woman went back to her home church, and it was almost as if she left Anna's soul in our care. You take it now. And Anna began coming to our church. A few months later, her husband began coming to our church, and they gave their lives to Christ. And 2 years later, I baptized Anna and her husband into the family of God. And And a year after that, they shared at the True City Conference about how through churches working together, they had come to find Christ. It's such a great example of someone saying, this isn't about our church numbers growing. This isn't about the success of our church. This is about what is best for the kingdom. And when churches work together, we can see God do amazing things. That's my favorite story.
Yeah. So over time, what was becoming clear is that the best thing, the really unexpected thing, was that a quality of unity was developing that was better and more important than all of these other kind of activities that we were doing. Somehow, by committing to doing things together, we came to really value each other. And it wasn't just the pastors. The congregations have come to value being in relationship with each other. Interestingly, it was not because of how aligned we all were that somehow this deepening of relationships happened in the midst of our differences. Little by little, we've come to realize that our differences are not a problem that we need to solve as much as they are a resource that we need to lean into. That the kind of unity that God has worked to produce among us is a unity across our differences. We were trying to do mission together. That was our primary goal. It remains the heartbeat of what True City is about. But in finding a new way to collaborate with each other, we ended up getting mission in the mix. Ended up getting unity in the mix. This new kind of collaboration was starting with mission instead of with specific theological traditions. This didn't mean that theology wasn't important to us, that we don't share key core convictions, but that we could begin with mission. We started to see that this was the Spirit's work, that we could work together across our differences, sitting at the same table, even if we disagreed on what kind of food we wanted to have, or what we should be wearing, or what time we should show up.
And of course, it's always been easy.
Yeah,
working together, like no problems.
Yeah,
we just always make it work.
No, not quite.
We kid.
Yes.
Unity has been beautiful, but this new kind of collaboration is not always easy. And from my own perspective, I actually started a little bit afraid. I told you about when Dave came and said, would you join in this gathering? And I was this 27-year-old lead female pastor at a Baptist church. And I wasn't exactly excited to go to this gathering with what would be all men from more conservative traditions than my own, almost all complementarians.
Not a quick sell, right?
Not a quick sell. And there's that nervousness that I wouldn't be accepted, that as sometimes unfortunately happens in groups I go to, right, that I'd be looked down on a bit, kind of ignored, chastised, not really part of the conversation. But I was welcomed at the table, and we began to learn from each other. I began to learn to make space in my heart for people that I was a little leery of, and I think they made space in their heart for me. As we went on, we kept having to face in our own lives and as churches these realities of what it means to work with people that think differently than us. And we had to ask ourselves, how much agreement do we have to do mission together? It's a question we still ask all the time around lots of different issues, not just complementarianism versus egalitarianism. It's included questions around how we should share the gospel, the role of social justice in sharing faith, and to be quite honest, in recent years, how we engage topics around the LGBTQ community. None of this has been easy, but there's been lots of ways that we've seen the work of gospel collaboration so much be worth it as we were willing to live in difference. I remember when we started organizing pulpit swaps, and we set this goal that we would all take turns, we would all have a Sunday where we would all preach in somebody else's pulpit, which is a big deal because we have a lot of different traditions. And I had agreed to coordinate this. I remember getting up at our leadership gathering and saying, so we're all going to send a pastor to a different church. You can email me privately any reason that you have that someone can't come to your church, because we had to make that space to understand that there would be traditions where certain things just wouldn't work. And so even within those differences, I said, and there'll be grace for you. It's okay. There won't be judgment. Someone might write and say, our church isn't quite ready for a female to speak, or someone from that tradition. But we could make it work. And then we had a Sunday where 20 churches flipped all their pastors, and they were all in different spots learning from each other. Sometimes it was a little more complicated than that, a little more painful. I remember the year that there was a conference coming to Hamilton called Act Like Men, which was hosted by Mark Driscoll and James MacDonald, which seems like a lifetime ago now. And there was a lot of tension in our movement around that conference. We had some groups who were coordinating their entire men's ministry to get every man in their church at this conference, which was for men to talk about biblical manhood. And we had a group of pastors in the True City movement that gathered people on the same night to have a discussion, a counter discussion about the theology of that kind of idea of biblical manhood. And there was tension about how different we felt, tension online, tension as we talked about it. And I still remember a couple weeks after this conference, getting together as a bunch of pastors and sitting around the table. And we were still in it together. And we got together to plan hampers and to start talking about our conference coming up. And we'd had this huge difference, and we could still gather around the table. It was as if we were seeing Jesus' prayer be answered. I feel like I see that all the time at True City, right? When Jesus said, I pray that they'll be one, just as I am one. For me, watching True City at work has been like watching the Holy Spirit bring that prayer into being at even the most surprising places.
Yeah, there's this really interesting contrast in how the word unity is used in the first part of Ephesians chapter 4 that for me is kind of this core biblical passage that speaks to what we've been experiencing. It's helped me grasp more fully what God's been up to among us. In verse 3 in that passage, the emphasis is on the here and now. We're told to maintain the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. The assumption is that this kind of unity already exists. We don't create it. The Spirit has already done that. Our job is to cultivate it. In verse 13, we are told that the purpose of the fivefold gifts are to build up the body until we reach unity of the faith. It's a point somewhere out there on the horizon when we collectively reach this point of maturity where we're all one. It's the time when together that maturity becomes the measure of the quality of our unity. We live now in the tension between these two realities. We are already one in Christ. Despite all appearances and popular perceptions, we share one life in the Spirit. But the Spirit is not content with this state of affairs. The Spirit gives us gifts so that we learn to work together and in the process become a whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, growing and building itself up in love as each part does its work. The Spirit is consistently calling us to come to a shared table built by this new kind of collaboration. It's clear that in this, that difference is key, that the eyes can't say to the ears, I don't need you, and that the foot can't say to the body, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong. There's no one church in any city that can reach that whole city by itself. And every church in the city is needed. They all have gifts to offer, no matter how small or how much they may be struggling. We've been asking ourselves for 17 years, what if instead of focusing on where we draw the lines, we are willing to lean in, to stretch out, to consider what that would look like? What if we really trusted what it says in Ephesians chapter 2, where we read that on the cross, Christ broke down every dividing wall and put to death all hostility so that nothing need separate us? Just think about that. All hostility has been put to death. The resources are there for us to overcome anything that divides us. Honestly, True City has a long way to go. We're not really close to this yet. But 17 years of committed relationship between a dozen churches, sometimes 24 churches, never yet 36, has taught us, has challenged us to lean into this possibility. We start to ask ourselves the questions like, can Baptists and Pentecostals work together? What about Reformed and Anabaptists? Is there space for us to bridge the gap and to be in communion with our Anglican brothers and sisters? What about with the Catholic Church in our city? Can small churches and multi-site churches work together? What about urban and suburban and rural churches?
And again, we ask, can egalitarians work with complementarians? Can my church, which is in the suburbs, really relate and engage in ministry with churches in our urban core? And can they engage with us? Can we move as a movement? This has been a big question for us, from being a predominantly white movement with white leadership to make space for traditions where there are greater representations of people in color and minorities. These are questions with which we've wrestled and still wrestled, but which we've also over and over heard God say, yes, this can happen. We have learned that unity is not easy, but there is another way of gospel collaboration, one that starts with mission together, with what we have in common, instead of shutting the door to working together because of the ways that we differ. When we began, we pointed your attention to this table. And this is where we want to tell you about this table. We mentioned earlier that each year we gather for a conference in our city to talk about mission in Hamilton. We use local speakers from our movement. We hear stories of things happening in Hamilton. And this particular year, the theme was show them the ropes. And we were talking about discipleship and what that role has in mission in our churches. And what we decided to do was during the conference, we had, during each of our keynote speakers, someone teach someone to the side. They were apprenticing them. Full disclosure, it was my husband and our youth pastor. So this is who we brought in. And so over in the corner, they were doing like woodworking, and he was showing her how to sand and, how to put things together. You really didn't know what was going on. And then as we got to the end of the conference and the last speaker finished, they brought over what they'd been building and they flipped over this communion table, which was meant to model this image of what it looks like when we journey with someone to teach them and to build them as disciples. And together they had made this communion table, which represented our churches for a lot of different reasons. Because my husband had actually gone to a bunch of the churches in the movement, actually to every church, and said, do you have any old wood lying around? It is shocking how many churches have wood in their church. They have old pews, they have old communion tables, old organs, old pulpits. And that communion table includes pieces of organs and pulpits and communion tables and pews from a dozen different churches, all together to make one beautiful table. That's what True City has been to us, that beautiful table around which we can gather.
So today, we ask you, you're all here watching from across the country. What if the churches around you were not your competition, but were your allies?
What if you learned from every church in your town or your city already at work where you will plant and where you will serve, and saw your work as adding to their ministries instead of starting again?
What if you trusted that the people who are different from you might actually be able to help you see new ways to experience God that will deepen your faith and strengthen your church?
What if working together meant there could be more stories like Anna's?
What if working together meant that established churches would gather around and support church plants instead of seeing them as a threat?
What if God had a new kind of collaboration for all of us?
What about if we could build tables together?